everyone. I'm just reading more of this book that I have. It's right here, and I've been really enjoying it. I told you that I might start at chapter 2, chapter 1, I think, but I'm already on chapter 3, so I'm just going to go ahead and read to you. Okay. We think that by protecting ourselves from suffering, we are being kind to ourselves. The truth is, we only become more fearful, more hardened, and more alienated. We experience ourselves as being separate from the whole. This separateness becomes like a prison for us, a prison that restricts us to our personal hopes and fears, and to caring only for the people nearest us. Curiously enough, if we primarily try to shield ourselves from discomfort, we suffer. Yet when we don't close off and we let our hearts break, we discover our kinship with all beings. In the aftermath of trauma, individuals' symptoms and difficulties reflect how their minds and bodies once tried to adapt to circumstances beyond their control. Not feeling alive in the present might have once served as an antidote to the threat of annihilation. If we don't feel alive, the threat loses its power to terrify us. Depression might have once provided a cushion against disappointment and being overwhelmed. Hypervigilance enables even children to stand guard over themselves. Numbing and loss of interest allow the individual protection against grief and disappointment. If you don't care, it doesn't matter anymore. Anger pushes others away before they can cause harm, or worse yet, before their survivor develops an attachment to them. It would be rare in the mental health treatment world to think of these symptoms as adaptive strategies made possible by the body's instinctive survival defenses. But from a neurobiologically informed perspective, they are survival resources, ways that the body and mind adapted for optimal survival in a dangerous world. In the worst of circumstances, our survival resources save us at a cost. By disowning the trauma or the anger or the need for contact with others, we lose or deny important aspects of ourselves. By over-identifying with the trauma-related shame, hopelessness, and fear of being seen, we constrict our lives and make ourselves smaller than we need to be. Both strategies, adaptive in a time of danger, become liabilities when the individual is ready to live a life after trauma, free of the constrictions and restrictions needed for living in a traumatogenic environment. In the absence of a context of meaning, i.e. a narrative, to explain their bewildering reactions, afraid to be curious, or even more afraid to face the events that created a need for these responses, clients assume the worst. They are crazy or damaged or inadequate. Without specialized training in trauma, most therapists would not know to be curious about differentiating normal emotional responses from traumatic reactions, desperate communication from parts, ingenious survival strategies, or implicit memories. Because the client presents in crisis or chaos with emotional pains or signs of a mental disorder, we feel a responsibility to diminish or alleviate the symptoms, curious about their origin in the childhood past, perhaps, but not necessarily curious about their role or their original purpose. When the therapist subsequently encounters resistance or trauma treatments become stuck, our theoretical models make meaning of it, but rarely do these theories assume a creative, adaptive explanation. When clients continue to live from crisis to crisis, or complain that they are not improving in therapy nor have energy for change, one hypothesis might be that they are help-rejecting complainers or passive-aggressive. Or the therapist might theorize that these clients are borderline, attention-seeking, or manipulative, acting out for some secondary gain. The ashamed, chronically depressed client might be described as having low self-esteem. Whether objectively accurate or not, these types of interpretations have gained clinicians little in terms of practical or successful client interventions for trauma. Working with the neurobiological legacy of trauma. In a neurobiological informed treatment, a different set of theoretical principles guides our thinking. The root causes of the client's difficulty, we now know, is not just the original event, but the reactivation of implicit memories by trauma-related stimuli that mobilize the emergency stress response as if the individual were in danger again. A trauma-informed treatment therefore focuses on recognizing and working in present time with the spontaneous evoking of implicit memory and animal defense survival responses, rather than creating a verbal narrative of past experiences. But since implicit memories encoded in nonverbal areas of the brain are subjectively experienced as emotional and physical reactions not distinguishable as memory, the first task of therapy is often to help clients recognize and befriend their triggered reactions, rather than react to them with alarm, avoidance, or negative interpretations. Many traumatized clients come to therapy with unusually difficult, painful histories. Severe childhood physical, emotional, and/or sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment at an early age, abuse, neglect coupled with other types of trauma, multiple perpetrators, or sadistic and malevolent abuse, accompanied by mind control practices, child pornography, or forced witnessing of violence. These complex histories are often accompanied by borderline presentations, more severe compartmentalization and dissociative disorders, or by more severe self-destructive, suicidal, and addictive behavior, or both. For over 20 years, the gold standard of trauma therapy has been phase-oriented treatment model as a sequential approach in which the consequences of autonomic dysregulation are treated first, and then only after a period of symptom stabilization, the traumatic memories and their implicit components are addressed. When the past is no longer alive in the client's body, can integration of past and present, child and adult, part and whole be completed. But for clients with chronic multi-layered trauma histories and severe dissociative symptoms, dysregulated unsafe behavior, or chronic stuckness, the goal of stabilization can be elusive. Years of treatment focused on self-regulation and avoidance of traumatic content sometimes leads only to small steps forward, or bigger steps forward, followed by a setback after setback. For fear of exacerbating the dysregulation, the therapist might inadvertently collude with the client's tendencies to ignore the trauma, or fearing empathic failure, the therapist might make the opposite mistake, allowing clients to say too much, and then, having triggered themselves, become overwhelmed or unsafe. Often the therapist comes to feel equally overwhelmed by the conflicting challenges of helping the client stabilize while also feeling heard and validated, and to resolve the past. a multi-consciousness approach to treatment. A parts approach offers some new possibilities for addressing these challenges. First and foremost, working with symptoms as manifestations of parts allows the therapist to incorporate mindfulness-based practices, helping clients notice their experience rather than get in touch with it. In traumatized clients, the heightened intensity or numbing caused by autonomic dysregulation makes getting in touch with feelings either overwhelming or deadening, either of which can evoke anxiety, depression, or impulsive behavior. Noticing, as in mindful awareness, allows the client to achieve dual awareness, the ability to stay connected to the emotional or somatic experience while also observing it from a very slight mindful distance. Secondly, a parts approach allows us to titrate emotions or memories. If one part is overwhelmed by emotional pain, other parts of the mind and body can be calm, curious, or even empathetic. If one part is remembering something alarming or devastating, other parts can offer support, validation, or comfort. As meditation practices, clinical hypnosis, and other uses of mindfulness attest, the human brain is capable of holding multiple states of consciousness in mind simultaneously, and this ability has important therapeutic uses. The left hemisphere is associated with more positive moods, and the right hemisphere with more negative states. The medial prefrontal cortex supports an observing consciousness that enables us to hover above whatever we are feeling so that it can be experienced as a feeling in the body rather than lead to re-traumatization. Using dual awareness, we have the capacity to fully inhabit the present moment, to feel our feet on the ground through awareness of body sensation while our visual perception takes in details of the room in which we are sitting, while in the same moment we can evoke an image from an earlier time in our lives that takes us back there to a state-specific memory. Describing these phenomena using the language of the brain, however, would not have the same result as does using the language of parts. To say, I can sense my medial prefrontal cortex is curious about the negative mood state connected to the right subcortical areas of my brain does not evoke interest, emotional connection, or self-compassion. When the therapist teaches clients to observe, I can sense in myself some curiosity about the depressed part sadness, they are more connected and attuned to their emotions and sensations. The first step toward achieving the ability to have compassion for themselves. Research shows that the medial prefrontal cortex is activated. There is a decrease in activity in the right hemisphere amygdala. It is most likely activation of the amygdala by trauma-related triggers that results in flashbacks, intrusive implicit memories, automatic animal defense responses, or parasympathetic responses of disconnection, numbing, or spacing out. Pathogenic kernels of memory. If the purpose of modern trauma therapy is no longer to treat traumatic events, what should be the focus? Vanderhart, Nijihui, and Steele have suggested that trauma treatment prioritize the effects or pathogenic kernels of the trauma. That is, those aspects of the post-traumatic legacy that still exert a traumatic effect on the client or constrict full participation in a normal life, even to this day. For example, even after years of therapy, Annie was still afraid to leave the house, resulting in a pattern of isolation, even though she hated feeling alone and lonely and stuck in the house. Though Annie was aware that it was safe in her small rural town, The shaking and trembling she experienced each time she tried to go out seemed more real than her factually based appraisal of her environment. When I asked her, what would have happened if you walked out the door in the home you grew up in? She replied, anyone could get me. Anyone. There was a long pause. No wonder I can't even open the front door now. It wasn't safe even to peek out my mother's door back then. Though differentiating the implicit memory from factual reality gave her insight, it did not change her ability to leave the house. Because the implicit memory was not held by Annie, but by a structurally dissociated young part of her. Once we identified the part who was afraid to leave the house, I asked Annie to inquire of the part. Ask her if she'd be willing to show you a picture that would help you understand what she's afraid will happen if you walk out this door. An image immediately came up connected to the experience of having been kidnapped at age 7. Is that what you're afraid of? She asked the child part. She could feel her head wanting to nod. Did you think it could happen again? Another nod. Spontaneously, Annie said to the part, did you know that can't happen at my house? She felt her head nodding again. Do you know why? Because I'm too big now, and no one can see you because you're inside me. She could feel a sense of relief and tension relaxing in her body each time she said again, no one can see you. They only see me because you're safe inside. Although there were many different traumatic events connected to the kidnapping, the pathogenic kernel that continued to affect her life and distort her reality was the experience of being away from home alone. That is what led up to the kidnapping. As we worked on ways of demonstrating to the part that Annie was too big to be kidnapped, such as measuring Annie's height on the door jamb and asking the little girl to show us how tall she was, the words that consistently regulated the little part were the words, they can't see you because you're inside me. All they can see is my big, tall body. Another pathogenic kernel was the absence of a protective adult who would have supervised a 7-year-old that night and made sure no one would take her. That also needs to be addressed. Unless her parts felt that someone cared about her, them, Annie disclosed, she had trouble feeling any safety, even in her home or her body, because their fears were so intense. As the parts explained to her, if someone cares about you, they watch over you to make sure nothing happens. In her previous therapy, Annie complied with the therapist's insistence as she repeatedly recall and re-experience the traumatic events, stimulating recurrent flashbacks in and out of therapy. She remembered wanting to tell the therapist that the excavation of memory was making her worse. But under the influence of young, attached for survival parts wanting the therapist to care about them, she did as the therapist said. Influenced by widespread belief in the talking cure, the pioneers in the trauma field initially assumed that creation of a narrative and being able to tell the story to a witness were sufficient to process what happened and resolve the symptoms. A corollary assumption was that the worst effects on the individual would be dictated by the worst aspects or details of the trauma. Therefore, one might think it important to process those worst memories. These assumptions leave therapists trained to use the phase-oriented treatment model in a quandary. While it does not feel empathetically attuned to ask clients to avoid telling their stories, the prioritizing of stabilization requires focusing away from traumatic events. On the other hand, meeting the client's need to get it out is also risky. The former risks empathetic failure, the latter risks destabilization. What does the therapist do when caught between a rock and a hard place? Acknowledging the past without exploring it. When did we start to understand traumatic memory from a neurobiological perspective? Client memories do not have to be avoided or discharged. We simply have to help clients develop a different relationship, both to their explicit and implicit memories. It is the details of memory and chronological scene-by-scene retelling that activates associated implicit memories, dysregulates the nervous system, and can have a re-traumatizing effect on the client. Acknowledging the trauma or implicit triggered memories is never unsafe, especially when we allude to the bad things that happened in a more general way without vivifying the details of them or using triggering language such as rape, incest, or penetration. When the therapist alludes to the unsafe world you grew up in or the years where nowhere was safe, most clients feel validated and supported. This matter-of-fact acknowledgement of the past often calms the traumatized nervous system rather than activating it. It conveys someone knows how it was. Excuse me. I should do this with some water. In addition, when they talk about a traumatic event, therapist and client have a choice of focus. I'm going to get some water. I'm not actually leaving. In addition, when they talk about a traumatic event, therapist and client have a choice of focus. They can concentrate on the experience of horror, most likely to trigger implicit memories, or on the victimization and objectification, most likely to trigger shame. Or they can bring attention to how the individual survived. How did he adapt to a traumatogenic environment? How did she fight or flee without incurring more punishment? How did he get up and go to school the next morning? Annie's fear of leaving the house and the need to have proximity to a protective figure were reflections on how she survived, via a hyper-vigilant anticipation of danger, constriction of her activities to what was safe, and I focus on pleasing people and gaining their loyalty. Though other parts longed to be part of a normal life and yearned for closer connections to others, the fearful, agoraphobic 7-year-old had been dictating defensive avoidance for many years. As Annie learned to correctly interpret her fear of leaving the house as communication from a frightened little girl, she could more easily work with her agoraphobia. She began by bringing up images of the door the little part was afraid to open, i.e. the door of her childhood home, and praising the 7-year-old for figuring out that she should never, ever, ever open that door. Then Annie would call up images of the door in her own home that she wanted to open to a safe neighborhood and community. She visualized taking hold of the 7-year-old's hand, somatically communicating that she was there and would not let anyone harm her. Over many weeks of Annie's patient reassurance and help in orienting her to the present by focusing on the images, this young child's part was increasingly able to trust that the door she and Annie opened was not the same door that once led to a dangerous world. A different approach to traumatic memory. In today's trauma treatment world, therapist and client have many more choices when it comes to treating traumatic memory. We can choose what kind of memory to treat, implicit or explicit memory, memories of dehumanizing events, or memories of ingenious survival, memories as held by parts, cognitive schemas, incomplete actions, or procedural memories of habitual actions and reactions. We can touch on memory by acknowledging it, naming it as a parts memory or as an implicit feeling or body memory. The therapist can help the client observe how it continues to exert its effects through pathogenic kernels that may or may not have any obvious connection to narrative. What is different is that the therapist no longer has to be focused on preferentially becoming a witness to the client's narrative, regardless of its effects on his or her symptoms and stability. Instead, the trauma therapist's job is to create in the therapy hour a neurobiologically regulating environment that enables the client's nervous system to experience greater safety and therefore an expanded capacity for tolerating both past and present experience. A different kind of witness. Although many clients are relieved to know that telling the story is a choice but not a requirement of therapy, some profess a longing or intense feeling of needing to tell someone what happened. A neurobiologically informed therapist can also bear witness to the individual's story, but in a different way than in traditional models. As a witness in psychodynamic approach, the therapist is a receptive listener who can tolerate hearing the story, even its horrifying details, and still be there for the storyteller. A good witness in this approach never interrupts, even when the client becomes autonomically activated or makes meaning of the events by constructing a self-defeating narrative, such as, "It was my fault." In a neurobiologically oriented world, this approach raises concerns. A story told chronologically and in detail to a silent witness is more likely to trigger trauma-related autonomic responses and implicit memories, reactivating the neural networks as if the client were again in danger. A silent listener without a way to keep track of the client's autonomic dysregulation or cortical activity, we have no way to know, is the client overwhelmed? Is the client able to mentalize and therefore witness being witnessed? Or is the prefrontal cortex shut down? If clients are dysregulated and cortically inhibited, they cannot take away a corrective memory or a coherent narrative of having been heard. Differentiating past from present. The ability to differentiate being triggered and being threatened is key to trauma treatment. We have to know we are safe now in order to effectively process how unsafe it was then. The therapist has to be curious. Can this client differentiate objectively between a trauma and a trigger? Or does he interpret the triggering as danger now? Without education about the phenomenon of implicit memory and a prefrontal cortex capable of taking in this new information, post-traumatic dysregulation, hypervigilance, impulsivity, and or shutdown will be repeatedly reinforced by the simple phenomenon of triggering. In the example below, Sheila insisted that telling her story was the only way that she could resolve the intense pressure she felt inside that kept communicating to her, "I have to tell someone." Switch it up a little different angle there. Yeah, a little bit. After setting a particular appointment time for this important moment of telling, Sheila arrived a few minutes late, a little breathless. First, I invited her to take a moment to let her breath settle. "We have all the time we need, all the time in the world," I said slowly and gently, a technique drawn from sensory-motor psychotherapy. "Take your time, and while you're getting your breath back, let's talk for a few minutes about this important process you want to have today. I know it's something you have felt an intense need for, to be heard and believed. But it is also going to bring up a lot. I just want to be sure that it's okay if I interrupt you from time to time to ask you how you're doing, to check on how your nervous system is coping, or slow things down so you can settle. It's my philosophy, on my watch, I don't want the telling of your story to be re-traumatizing. So I might be annoying from time to time because I'm going to interrupt to make sure that doesn't happen. Is that okay? Getting the client's explicit permission for an intervention is another important principle of treatment in sensory motor psychotherapy. Sheila begins to describe the environment in which the abuse took place. My mother was not the right match for my super intellectual father. She wanted nice clothes and pretty things. He was frugal and worried about money. He did not like conflict or emotionality. She was always highly emotional. It was hard to be around her because she would suddenly go into a rage. Seeing her activation rising as she recalled her mother's rages and noticing how little she was breathing, I interrupted. How are you doing right now, Sheila? That's a lot to remember. I'm a little overwhelmed, but I'm managing okay. When I was talking about my mother and her anger, I suddenly remembered something. She used to beat me when I was too emotional, especially if I got angry or cried. I could cry and scream. She could cry and scream at me, but I couldn't scream back. She could yell, but you couldn't. I mirrored her words so that she could hear them and take them in. And you were just a little girl. Sheila begins to cry. Me. Yes, lots of feelings coming up. Painful feelings. Of course, you were just a little girl and you couldn't get mad. You couldn't cry. Lots of feelings there. Just notice, though, right here, right now, the little girl inside is crying and no one is getting mad at her. You and I are hearing her cry and hearing her feelings. We are not mad. We feel for her. Ask her to notice that it's different here. It's different with you and me. Right this minute, she is being heard, and we are feeling for her. In a more traditional psychodynamic approach, the therapist would most likely have spoken less and certainly interrupted less, but all of the interruptions had a purpose. To help Sheila stay here instead of going there. To help her slow down and pay attention to her breathing and activation. To keep her prefrontal cortex online and make sure she could witness being witnessed, and to provide a different experience, an antidote for her young child self. Witnessing being witnessed. To activate the purpose of witnessing, it is of crucial importance to remember that the longing to be heard may be a natural human response to having to keep terrible secrets, but it is also an implicit memory. Few children tell their stories to someone at the time of the abuse, leaving a memory of the longing or impulse to tell that was never satisfied. Often the clients who are desperate to tell are being driven by that implicit memory. In addition, the wish to tell or be heard does not guarantee that the client can remain fully present in the moment when activated by the details of the narrative. The syndrome of post-traumatic stress disorder reflects the degree to which traumatic reactions can intrude upon and upstage the experience of being here now. The research is clear that trauma-related stimuli, including one's own narrative, stimulates the body to alarm responses, animal defense reactions, and inhibition of prefrontal activity, all of which prevent witnessing the therapist's attentive presence. In sensory-motor psychotherapy, the therapist periodically directs the client's attention back to the present moment by asking clients to pause for a moment and just notice what's happening right now. You are telling your story, and I'm hearing you. I'm hearing you, and I believe you. Notice what that's like to feel me here with you, listening to you, and believing you. In a parts approach, I might ask, what's it like for the parts to hear those words, I believe you? In sensory motor psychotherapy, the therapist would next ask, what happens in your body when you notice that? Or, what happens inside when I say the words, I hear you and I believe you? I can also bring the client's attention to the difference between now and then. I am hearing you and I believe you. I'm hearing you and I'm not angry. I'm hearing you and I'm not going away. I hear you and I'm not shocked, not horrified. Just notice that. What's it like to have someone hear you without shock or horror? At these moments of recognition, when the client can experience how different now is, how attentively someone listens now, and how it feels to be believed. The old experience has changed. There is a different ending to the story now, and that changes the feeling inside. The therapist as auxiliary cortex and educator. In a neurobiologically informed treatment approach, the issues presented by traumatized clients examined. Brain scan evidence on traumatic recall of events is clear that traumatic memory evokes speechless terror and experiences beyond words. The prefrontal cortex, inhibited by autonomic responses to traumatic memory, cuts them off from language areas of the brain. Their ability to observe even their own experience verbally and sequentially is lost. The overwhelming emotions and physical impact are too big to be captured by language. After the events are over, many victims attempt to put words to what has just happened, but can only approximate a feeling of what happened, biased by whatever meaning-making they have attached to the event. Often these stories are distorted by the experience of degradation, humiliation, terror, and abandonment. They do not capture the event itself, but rather how the victims experience themselves as a result of it. Shame, feeling dirty or disgusting or painfully exposed is not a description of an event. They are the implicit memories of the effects of that event on them. A neurobiologically informed therapist is aware that clients do not know these facts about traumatic remembering. They have not read the brain scan research, and they do not know why they can't remember it all, or why they only remember in fragments that feel unreal, or why they feel so much shame, or that they are afraid of remembering it all. They experience themselves as crazy or inadequate or damaged without understanding the role of trauma in biasing their interpretations, without the words and without a template to make meaning of what has happened, let alone understand their resulting symptoms. Our clients will not be able to make headway in therapy or in their normal lives. It therefore becomes imperative for the therapist to act as an educator and temporary auxiliary cortex. When the therapist is willing to reinterpret the client's self-defeating story and give it psychoeducationally informed meaning, it has a different effect than providing empathy or challenging distorted cognitions. When the therapist provides a template for understanding the trauma-related symptoms or the phenomenon of triggering, and make sense of their prefrontal shutdown and animal defenses, clients are reassured that there is logic to their actions and reactions, what I call trauma logic. Lillian provides us with an illustration of these issues and how I dealt with them on the occasion of our first meeting. 70 years old and a recently retired pediatrician, Lillian appeared barely able to walk, even with the help of her son, who had set up a consultation to find out what's wrong with my mother. Shaking, trembling, her head hanging, she made her way into the office and sat on the couch, rocking back and forth like a small child. "All I can say is I feel like a frightened child, and I don't know why," she said. "I'm afraid of my own shadow. I can't look at you. I can't go out of the house by myself." I asked, "When did this frightened child appear? When did the fear begin?" After a terrifying childhood, Lillian described herself as having become a headstrong, independent young adult, determined to become a doctor and help children around the world. That fearlessness persisted for many decades. In her pediatric career, raising her children as a single mother, then volunteering for Doctors Without Borders after retirement. She came home from Africa at the age of 70 without a job, structure, or a cause. I was just alone in the house all day. I felt lonely and useless and of no value. And then the fear started. I said excitedly, "I just realized what might have happened, Lillian. Can I tell you the story about what is going on right now?" She nodded. A very brave young woman left home 50 years ago, walked away from the trauma and intimidation, and she never looked back. There was a lot of trauma in her body, a lot of traumatized young parts. But she had a strong drive to build a normal life, and she did. With that strong, determined, normal lifestyle, she created a family and chose a career, and even fulfilled her goal of helping children just as afraid as she was once. She never looked back, even once. But after the return from Africa, there were no more goals for the normal life part to pursue. No more people to help her kids to raise, nothing to keep her going. The empty house and loneliness triggered the young, traumatized parts she'd been able to ignore for so many years. Triggered by being alone in the house, they began to have intense feeling and body memories of feeling hopeless, unlovable, alone, and most of all, scared out of their minds. This fear you are having is a memory. They're feeling memory of what it was like to be in their home, in your family's home. "What do I do?" she asked. Me. Think as a mother and pediatrician for a moment. What do we do when a child is feeling scared and doesn't know she's safe? When the scary feeling is a memory? Lillian. We'd reassure that she's safe. Me. Okay, what would you do if she didn't believe you right away? Lillian. We'd have to tell her over and over again. Tell her that we're there and there's nothing that can hurt her now. You know children well, don't you? Yes. You'd have to tell her over and over, wouldn't you? Can you start now? Just tell her your feelings and your body. Tell her with your feelings and your body that you're here. Lillian was quiet for a moment, and then she chuckled. "Smart kid," she says. "If there's nothing scary happening, why am I so scared?" Me. Explain to her that you did get scared. You got frightened when she got scared. Always tell the truth to her, because no one ever did that before. Lillian was quiet again, her attention inside. She likes me admitting that I got scared too, but then I told her that I looked around and nothing bad was happening. And that's why I came here today, even though I was scared. Me. Right. It isn't that grown-ups never get scared, but they do something different with their fear than kids do. Lillian. Yeah, now I have to remember not to get scared when she gets scared. Me. That's right. You do not want to blend with her fear, because then she has no one. You want her to have access to your confidence and courage, so it'll be there for her too. In this single session, it was immediately clear to me that Lillian's return from Africa had stimulated a flooding of implicit memories of terror, loneliness, shame, and fears of abandonment. She had neither the knowledge base nor the words to explain her sudden transformation from confident globetrotter to quivering child, other than I feel like a frightened child. Notice that the therapist educator does not hesitate to make psychoeducational meaning of the client's symptoms and story, and to introduce words like trigger, part, feeling memory, dysregulation. A therapist educator does not deflect or interpret a question such as, "What do I do?" Knowing that the question is a request from the normal life self for a roadmap, the therapist provides both concrete information and the opportunity to experiment with using it. Clearly, Lillian's frightened part had hijacked the body, inhibiting her prefrontal cortex from being able to conceptualize and answer the question, "What is wrong with me?" If the therapist's role is to educate rather than to elicit the client's interpretation of what is wrong, then this question provides an opportunity to teach the client about autonomic dysregulation, implicit memory, and structural dissociation. Lillian's description. I've turned into a frightened child. Immediately opened the door to the discussion of child parts, and although it was only the second or third sentence she uttered, I did not hesitate to say, "Yes, you have. You have been hijacked by a very young, very scared little girl." Another client might have described it as, "My body is running amok. I can't sleep. Can't stop shaking. I'm paralyzed." Calling for psychoeducation about the body's participation in trauma-related symptoms, some narratives might have emphasized deficiencies. "I've fallen apart. I'm so ashamed. I don't want anyone to see me like this. I'll never be the person I used to be." For clients with shame-related cognitive schemas, psychoeducation becomes imperative to help them disidentify from the self-defeating story of narrative or of failure and inadequacy. They will need education about their symptoms. Yes, it feels like you've fallen apart and you don't want anyone to see you. The good news is that you haven't fallen apart. Your body is just remembering feeling broken, shattered. The shame is a feeling of memory too. The shame is a feeling memory too that often helps keep children safer. When clients lament that the person I used to be is alive and well in there, when clients lament that they'll never be the person I used to be, they can often be reassured the person I used to be is alive and well in their left hemispheres. They're re-experiencing limbic hijacking, which inhibits cortical functioning and thereby disconnects them from the person I used to be. As illustrated in the session with Lillian, another important part of the therapist educator's role to help clients connect not only to their vulnerability, but also to their strengths. Historically, trauma-related treatment has emphasized helping clients get in touch with the vulnerable emotions of fear, grief, and shame, and with their rage, with the expectation that grief and anger will empower, dissipate shame, and free them to let go of the past. However, clients often get stymied when the anger and grief are overwhelming rather than empowering, or when shame is exacerbated rather than relieved by access to grief. In addition, focus primarily on trauma-related emotions creates a bias in the treatment by leaving out a very important aspect of any traumatic experience: how the child's survival resources and animal defenses enabled him or her to remain intact, to keep on keeping on. A creative adaptation to abnormal experience. even when the only option is to feign death, go numb, pretend to be asleep, float up to the ceiling, or go unconscious. The body instinctively chooses the defense response most likely to succeed in limiting the injury, shock, or pain. When we freeze, inhibit active defenses, and can't speak, it is also adaptive. What could we say that wouldn't provoke the aggression? When children fight back, even if it's a losing battle, their animal defense systems may instinctively assess that in this situation, it is safer to fight than to submit, even though it might result in punishment. It seemed important to emphasize the strengths connected to Lillian's going on with her normal life self, to reassure her that we can temporarily lose access to a part of the brain, but unless we sustain a brain injury, those strengths are still encoded and potentially accessible. The intrepid, determined woman she had been most of her adult life was still intact and available for reconnection. At the moment, a trigger precipitates flooding of implicit memories held by structurally dissociated parts. The client frequently loses access to verbal information or conceptual thinking. For the time being, Lillian was going to need her therapist to be an auxiliary cortex, providing psychoeducation about trauma and parts, helping her test drive different interventions and practice those that worked, and mapping out, step by step, how to stop the flooding and access her normal life self once again. Her biggest risks were going to be regression and avoidance. Without a therapy that emphasized the importance of using mindful observation, curiosity, and psychoeducation to gain access to her normal life self, Lillian would be at risk to blend the parts and become a frightened child rather than building relationships with them, or having reconnected to her going on with her normal life self. She might feel so much relief that it might be tempting to ignore and suppress the trauma-related parts again. In the initial consultation session, it was important to establish a way of working that emphasized that she could heal and go on with her life. If she were willing to build a protective and caring relationship with her young parts by calling upon the same determination to help suffering children that had been her strength and motivation since her 20s. A new role for the therapist, neurobiological regulator. In early attachment relationships, parent figures provide not only an auxiliary cortex for their infants, but also externally mediated neurobiological regulation or soothing. Successfully regulating a child's immature nervous system is necessary not only for his or her sense of attunement and well-being, but also critical for growing affect tolerance via an expanding window of tolerance that allows children to increasingly regulate and tolerate a range of emotions. Child neglect, trauma, early loss, witnessing of violence, or frightening caregiving all interfere with attachment information, and therefore with developing a spacious and flexible window of tolerance that fosters resilience. With or without childhood trauma, adult traumatic experiences such as combat, assaults, rape, and domestic violence disrupt previously established autonomic patterns and prime the nervous system to respond to environmental stressors with over or under activity. The result is a client who enters therapy with a dysregulated nervous system and a truncated window of tolerance, with a brain conditioned to activate the emergency stress response system in the presence of trauma-related stimuli. Unless the therapist is prepared to offer interactive neurobiological regulation, a dysregulated client will encounter difficulty with some of the basic aspects of traditional psychotherapy. The request to free associate or say what comes to mind, the ability to connect, to affect, to trust the therapist's good intentions, to focus, conceptualize, why he or she is there, what hopes or goals bring the client to therapy. Connect past, present, and sit with whatever emotions and physical reactions are activated in the course of the therapeutic hour without hyper or hypo arousal, dissociation, or impulsive responses. This is a challenging expectation, one for which a window of tolerance and prefrontal cortex are necessary prerequisites. At her first visit, Carla, a 45-year-old attorney, was visibly shaking as she described why she was there. Her speech pressured, she leaned forward as if ready to leap out of her chair at a moment's notice. I haven't been able to eat or sleep in months. My last therapist said she couldn't help me, and this new one lets me out early each week because I get too overwhelmed to do the work, she calls it. Holding out her shaking hands for me to see, she asked, why isn't the work helping me with this at all? Why does the work have to be about the abuse? I don't know how I'm managing at my job, but it's the only place I almost feel like my old self. Talking very slowly and calmly to slow the pace of conversation, but with a smile to signal that things were not so bad as she felt, I said, I have good news and I have bad news for you. Which do you want first? More smiling. The bad news, Carla said. Better to get it over with. The bad news is that you are flooded with trauma-related feelings and body memories. Your nervous system has gone through the roof into extreme hyperarousal. Do you want the good news? The good news is that you are not going crazy. The therapist laughs and smiles, and Carla does too. In fact, there is a very simple remedy for this. Would you like to hear it? Yes. To help your nervous system and stop the flooding of feeling memories, we need to get your frontal lobes back online. That is why you feel better at work. Your job requires you to think. It pulls your prefrontal cortex to do what it does so well. In this vignette, I use a number of tools available to all therapists. My tone of voice, pacing of speech, smiling and laughing, versus a serious facial expression, choice of focus, beliefs, affect, body vulnerability, strength, parts. Projecting a confident energy versus a questioning, more tentative energy. Focusing attention on the client's strengths often elicits a moment of recognition and reconnection to resources long forgotten. Reframing negative interpretations or providing corrective information helps to change the story, elicits curiosity, and even regulates the nervous system. To help facilitate her prefrontal cortex back online, I next provide some psychoeducation by reinterpreting Carla's difficulties as dysregulation. No one can think clearly or manage intense feelings when the nervous system is in a state of traumatic activation. It's too overwhelming. So, let's go very slowly and stay curious. I'm going to ask you to pause and just notice what your body is doing right now. The shaking has gone down, she observed in a less pressured tone. I feel less speedy and on edge. Actually, as soon as you said, we need to get your frontal lobes back online, I felt better. Great. Your body really responds to those words. All we have to do is get your frontal lobes back online. Now let's be curious about what else gets your frontal lobes back online rather than going to work. Over the years, has your prefrontal cortex been a resource to you? Oh yes, I'm a civil rights attorney. I have to inspire people, challenge them, out-argue them, make them see what needs to be done. Wonderful, your prefrontal cortex is a resource, and so is your sense of purpose, being more determined than the other side. Now we need to focus on your determination to get your frontal lobes back online. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to notice when you're speeding up and when you're starting to feel more shaky and overwhelmed. Then pause and just keep saying to yourself, I'm triggered. These are feeling memories or body memories. Which do you prefer? Feeling memory or body memory? Body memory, it makes me feel, it feels like my whole body, not just my feelings. Wonderful. Then remind yourself that it's just your body being triggered, just body memory, and then become interested and curious in what's happening rather than panicking. As the session continued, the therapist kept watching for signs that Carla was getting hyper-aroused again, asked her to pause periodically, and then use her frontal lobes to be curious and interested in these body memories, while trying to figure out what event they were best matched. Each time the observing curiosity slowed her down, increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, settled her nervous system a bit, and allowed her to think more clearly. Alright, this is kind of a long chapter, and I'm getting very sleepy, so thank you for making it to the end of this video, and thank you to Janina Fisher for writing such an interesting book. I'm really looking forward to a second read where I can perhaps translate it into some more vivid and useful, less clinical language. Anyways, have a good night.